Hetty Vance was 26, and in the dusty heart of 1870s Texas, that was an age that invited comment. The comment she was about to receive would land like a branding iron in the middle of Abernathy's general store, held up for the whole town to witness. She was a woman of quiet use, her hands always busy with some mending or healing, but the man whose notice she had hoped to earn was about to declare her useless. Across the room, leaning against a stack of feed sacks, a cowboy named Cass Holloway watched it all, and what he saw was something the rest of the town had been too blind to count. He had already decided something, a thought so clear and sharp it felt like a stone in his hand, though he had not yet said it aloud. But the life they were about to build, a life of quiet mornings and coffee left on the stove, would begin not with a soft word, but with a public defiance that would echo from the church steps to the last fence post of the county. Stay close and let us know in the comments where you're watching from. The woman they called Too Slow stood perfectly still as the pronouncement was made. Hetty Vance had come into the general store for thread, a simple errand on a Tuesday afternoon. She had felt the weight of Mr. Abernathy's gaze for months, a sizing up that felt less like courtship and more like a farmer judging livestock. She was a big woman, tall and broad-shouldered, with hands made for work, not for playing the piano. She moved with a deliberation that impatient men called slow. Mr. Abernathy, a man whose own life was a study in fussy, hurried movements, had finally reached his conclusion. He held up a spool of black thread as if it were a gavel. "No, Hetty," he said, his voice carrying through the suddenly quiet store. "I don't think this is a match." He wasn't talking about the thread. Every person present, Mrs. Gable by the pickle barrel, young Timmy sweeping the floor, 2 ranchers waiting on tack, knew it. He was publicly, cruelly, ending a courtship that had never truly begun. "A man in my position needs a wife who is brisk," he continued, warming to his audience. "Spry. A woman of my standing can't be saddled with someone who takes half the morning to decide on a ribbon." He gestured to her frame. "It's a matter of economy. You're built for drawing water, not for greeting customers." He smiled, a thin, satisfied line. It was a dismissal, a public branding, useless for the finer things, too plain, too large, too slow for a man of town importance. Hetty felt the heat rise in her cheeks, but she held her chin level. Her hands, clasped in front of her, did not tremble. She had a small, worn leather satchel at her feet, filled with the herbs and linens she used to tend to the town's small miseries. It was the sum of her worth, and she knew it. She met Mr. Abernathy's gaze and gave a single, almost imperceptible nod. She would not give him the satisfaction of a tear or a retort. She would simply absorb the blow, as she had absorbed others. She had learned long ago that stillness was her only armor. The silence in the store was thick with pity and a grim, fascinated satisfaction. She was a spectacle, a lesson, a woman put in her place. From his place by the feed sacks, Cass Holloway did not move. He had been in town for supplies, a monthly ritual. He was a man who preferred the company of horses and the wide, silent expanse of his ranch to the jostle of Main Street. He was not a man for other people's business, but this had become his business. He'd watched Hetty Vance for the better part of a year, not with the calculating eye of Mr. Abernathy, but with a quiet, steady attention. He'd seen her sit up all night with the blacksmith's colicky baby, her broad hands gentle and sure on the infant's back. He'd seen her deliver a poultice to a ranch hand with a festering wound, her voice low and calm. He'd seen her leave a small parcel of mended clothes on the porch of the widow Jensen, who had 3 boys and no time. He saw not slowness, but a deep, unhurried competence. He saw not a plain, oversized woman, but a strength that the brittle, chattering women of the town could not comprehend. Her stillness under Abernathy's attack was not weakness. It was a dam holding back a river. He saw the fine lines of exhaustion around her eyes and the way her worn dress hung on her, clean but frayed at the cuffs. He saw a woman who gave everything and asked for nothing. A woman who was being told she had no value by a man who wouldn't know value if it was written on a bill of sale. Cass was a man of few words, and he did not believe in grand gestures. But as he watched Hetty turn, her back straight as a fence post, to walk out of that store with her dignity in shreds, something in him broke its tether. He knew what loneliness was. He had lived with its ghost for 5 years, in a quiet house that was clean but not warm. He saw a mirror of that same solitude in her, and the injustice of it was a burr under his saddle. He pushed himself off the feed sacks, his decision made. It was not a decision born of romance. It was born of anger, of recognition, and a sudden, clarifying certainty. He knew what this was. He had known for some time, and he was not going to let her walk out of that store alone. His boots made a solid, deliberate sound on the floorboards, a sound that cut through the whispering. As Hetty reached the door, a wall of faded denim and solid muscle blocked her way. Cass Holloway stood before her, his hat in his hands. He was not looking at her, but past her, his gaze fixed on Mr. Abernathy. The store held its breath. Cass was a known quantity in town. Quiet, hard-working, kept to himself. No one had ever seen him interfere. "Abernathy," he said, his voice not loud, but low and carrying a weight that made the shopkeeper flinch. "You're a fool." He didn't wait for a response. He turned his attention to Hetty. His eyes, the color of a winter sky, were serious. They held no pity, only a kind of plain, factual assessment. He took in her still face, the rigid set of her shoulders. "Miss Vance," he said, his voice softer now, but still audible to everyone in the room. He took a breath. "That man is wrong. You are not useless." He paused, and the silence stretched. "In my eyes, you are priceless." The word landed in the room with the force of a thrown stone. Priceless. It was the opposite of every single thing Abernathy had implied. Hetty's composure finally wavered. A flicker of disbelief, of raw shock, crossed her face. Before she could process it, he continued, "I have a ranch. It's not much, but it's mine. It needs a woman's hand. My house needs a heart." He looked at her directly, a straight, unadorned appeal. "Marry me, Hetty. Be my wife." A collective gasp went through the store. It was not a proposal. It was a declaration of war on public opinion. It was rescue and defiance all at once. Hetty stared at him. Cass Holloway. She knew him by sight. A man who bought his supplies, nodded a greeting, and left. He had a small spread west of town. A widower, they said. She looked from his steady face to Abernathy's slack-jawed outrage, then to the avid, staring eyes of the other customers. She had no prospects. She had a small room she rented by the week and a satchel of herbs. She had her pride, and it was bleeding out on the floor of the general store. This offer was a lifeline, but it was more than that. It was a shield. In his eyes she saw no guile, no trick, just a plain, simple statement. She took his measure, the quiet strength in his shoulders, the weathered lines around his eyes. He was not a man who spoke idly. She drew in a slow breath, the first full breath she'd taken since Abernathy started talking. "Yes," she said, her voice clear and firm. "Yes, Mr. Holloway, I will." The walk to the justice of the peace was a blur. The town seemed to part before them, whispers following in their wake like dust kicked up by a wagon. Cass's hand rested lightly on the small of her back, a solid, grounding presence. He did not speak. The justice, a man named Miller with spectacles perched on his nose, looked from Cass's determined face to Hetty's composed one. and seemed to understand that questions were not required. The ceremony was over in minutes, the words stark and binding in the small, stuffy office. She was Mrs. Holloway. The name felt foreign, a garment borrowed in haste. They walked out into the afternoon sun, and for the first time, Cass seemed uncertain. He gestured to his wagon, loaded with the feed sacks he had come for. "My place is a few miles out," he said. It was not an apology, but a statement of fact. She nodded, climbing onto the wagon seat without assistance, her satchel placed carefully at her feet. The ride was silent. The landscape shifted from the huddled buildings of the town to the open rolling land of the prairie. The wind carried the scent of dust and dry grass. Hetty watched the horizon, her mind a quiet blank. The shock had given way to a strange, hollow calm. She had been publicly shamed and publicly claimed in the space of 10 minutes. She did not know the man beside her. She did not know the life she was riding toward. She only knew the life she had left behind, and there was nothing there to miss. The Holloway Ranch was a small, well-kept spread, a modest house, a solid barn, and fences that were straight and true. A horse watched them from a side pen, its tail flicking. It was a place of order and solitude. Cass pulled the wagon to a stop and came around to help her down, his hand strong and calloused around hers. Inside, the house was spare and impeccably clean. A simple table and 2 chairs in the main room. A stone fireplace, swept clean. A kitchen with a cast-iron stove that gleamed from a recent polishing. It was a man's house, orderly and functional, but it lacked any softness. There was a door leading to a back room and another to what she presumed was the main bedroom. "The bedroom is yours," Cass said, breaking the silence. His voice was gruff, as if the words were unfamiliar. "It's proper. I'll take the cot in the back. It's what I'm used to." He would not look at her. He was already creating distance, establishing the terms of their strange arrangement. This was a marriage in name, a practical matter. He had rescued her reputation, but he was asking for nothing in return. She nodded, her throat tight. She walked into the bedroom. It was as spare as the rest of the house. A sturdy bed with a patchwork quilt, a small wardrobe, a washstand. She set her leather satchel down on the floor by the bed, placing it with the care of someone used to needing to find it again in the dark. It was the only thing in the room that was hers. She looked at its worn, familiar shape against the unfamiliar floorboards and felt a profound and dizzying sense of displacement. She was a wife, but she felt like a guest who had overstayed her welcome before she had even arrived. The first days of their marriage were a careful dance of avoidance. They moved around each other in the small house like 2 wary strangers, the silence thick with unspoken questions. Hetty rose before dawn, a habit born of years of starting her day with the needs of others. She found the kindling box full and the wood stove cold. She built a fire, her movements practiced and efficient, and put the coffee on to boil. When Cass came in from the barn, stamping the chill from his boots, the scent of coffee filled the air. He stopped in the doorway, surprised. "You don't have to do that," he said, his voice rough with sleep. "I can manage." "It's no trouble," she replied, not looking at him, her attention on the bacon sizzling in the skillet. The next morning, she woke to the low crackle of a fire already built. The stove was warm, a faint heat spreading through the kitchen. A pot of coffee sat on the back burner, waiting. He had risen in the dark to light it for her. He said nothing about it when he came in for breakfast, and she said nothing in return. But the gesture settled in the quiet space between them, a single, sturdy stone laid in a foundation she hadn't known they were building. She began to learn the rhythms of his life. He was a man of deep routine. He mended his own tack, his large hands surprisingly deft with the needle and awl. He kept his tools clean and in their place. His world was one of competence and self-reliance. Hetty, in turn, found her own place in that world. She took over the cooking, her meals simple but plentiful. She discovered a pile of his work shirts, torn and frayed, and set about mending them. Her stitches were small and neat, a line of perfect patient care. She darned his socks until the heels were more her work than the original wool. One afternoon, he came up the porch steps and caught his boot on a loose board, stumbling slightly. He cursed under his breath and went straight to the barn for his tools. An hour later, the sound of his hammer was the only sound in the quiet afternoon. The next time she swept the porch, the board was solid under her feet. He never mentioned it. They ate their suppers at the small table, the scrape of forks on plates the only conversation. At first, the silence had been a chasm. Now it was beginning to feel like a shared space. One evening, he was late, caught up fixing a fence line before a storm rolled in. Hetty kept his supper warm on the back of the stove. When he finally came in, soaked and weary, he saw the plate waiting for him. He looked at it, then at her, a flicker of something unreadable in his eyes. "You didn't have to hold it," he said. "It keeps fine," she answered. He sat and ate in silence, but when he was done, he carried his plate to the wash basin himself. It was a small thing, but it felt like an acknowledgement. A recognition that this was no longer just his house. It was theirs. The news of their marriage spread through the high grass and dusty streets like a prairie fire. The town of Redemption was divided. Some saw Cass Holloway as a fool, saddled with a woman another man had publicly discarded. Others, mostly women, saw it as a grand, romantic gesture, though they whispered their admiration behind their hands. Martha Abernathy, the shopkeeper's wife, made her opinion known to anyone who would listen. "An act of charity," she sniffed over the counter of her husband's store. "He'll regret it before the first snow. The man's lonely is all. He's bought damaged goods." Hetty heard the whispers when she went to town for supplies. She felt the stares, a mixture of curiosity and pity. She kept her gaze forward, her expression placid, her satchel held firmly in her hand. She was Mrs. Holloway now, but in their eyes she was still the woman from Abernathy's store. Then, Mrs. Gable's youngest boy, Sam, came down with a fever that wouldn't break. The doctor was miles away in the next county, and the boy was delirious. In desperation, Mr. Gable rode out to the Holloway ranch. He found Cass in the barn. "My boy," he said, his face haggard. "They say your wife. They say she has a way with herbs." Cass looked at the man's desperate face and simply nodded toward the house. Hetty came to the door, wiping her hands on her apron. She listened without expression as Gable explained, his words tumbling over each other. She asked a few quiet questions, then turned and picked up her worn leather satchel. "I'll come," she said. She sat by Sam's bed for 2 days and 2 nights. She bathed his face with cool water, spooned a bitter tea of willow bark and yarrow between his lips, and spoke to him in a low, soothing murmur. Cass appeared on the second day with a basket containing a loaf of bread, a jar of broth, and a clean change of clothes for her. He didn't stay long, just met her eyes with a steady, questioning look. She gave a small nod, and he left. On the 3rd morning, the fever broke. Sam woke up, weak but clear-eyed, and asked for a drink of water. Mrs. Gable wept with relief and tried to press a few coins into Hetty's hand. Hetty gently refused. "I'm glad he's well," she said, and packed her satchel to go home. The story traveled faster than the gossip. A week later, one of the hands from the Miller ranch got his leg tangled in a rope and took a bad fall. The bone in his forearm snapped. Hetty, hearing the news, simply took her satchel and walked the 2 miles to the Miller bunkhouse. She worked with the foreman to set the bone, her hands strong and sure, her voice calm as she directed them. She fashioned a splint from scavenged boards and clean linen. She left instructions for a poultice to keep the swelling down, and then walked home. People started to see her differently. Her size was no longer awkwardness. It was strength. Her slowness was no longer a defect. It was a deep, unshakable calm. When she walked through town, the nods were more frequent. The stares held less pity and more respect. She was useful. She knew this was not the same as being known or liked, but it was a start. It was a currency she understood. One evening, Cass found her on the porch, watching the sunset, her mending basket in her lap. "Mrs. Gable brought by a pie," he said, standing in the doorway. "Said to thank you." "That was kind of her," Hetty said. "She said you have good hands," Cass added, his voice quiet. He lingered for a moment. "She's right." He turned and went back inside before she could think of a reply. The words settled over her, warm and solid in the cooling air. Good hands. It was the highest compliment a man like Cass Holloway could pay. The chill of late autumn began to settle over the land, frosting the fence posts in the mornings and sharpening the wind that swept down from the ridges. The days grew shorter, the evenings longer. The small house held its warmth, the fire in the stone hearth, a constant, glowing heart. The silence between Hetty and Cass had gentled, transforming from a space of caution into one of comfortable quiet. They had found a rhythm that worked without words, a partnership built on shared tasks and mutual respect. One evening, a fierce storm blew in, a torrent of wind and rain that rattled the windows. Hetty had spent the day helping a neighbor, Sarah Mills, whose husband was away, bring in her last harvest before the weather turned. She'd returned late, bone-weary and soaked through. Cass had the fire blazing and a pot of stew simmering on the stove. After they ate, Hetty sank into the lone armchair by the hearth, her mending basket forgotten at her feet. The heat from the fire was a heavy, comforting blanket. She meant only to rest her eyes for a moment, listening to the sound of the rain and the steady crackle of the flames. She drifted asleep, her head eventually tipping to the side until it came to rest against the rough wool of Cass's sleeve. He had been sitting on a stool nearby, oiling a piece of harness. When he felt the light pressure against his arm, he went completely still. He looked down at her face, softened in sleep, the lines of weariness smoothed away by the firelight. Her breathing was deep and even. He saw the fraying at the collar of her dress, the calluses on her fingers where they rested in her lap. He felt a surge of something fierce and protective, an emotion that startled him with its intensity. He carefully, slowly, set the harness aside. He did not move his arm. He sat there for a long time, a living statue guarding her sleep. The fire began to die down. He rose, every movement deliberate and silent, and added another log, coaxing the flames back to life. He then retrieved his heavy canvas coat from the peg by the door. Gently, so as not to wake her, he draped it over her, tucking it around her shoulders and over her lap. He stood for another moment, watching the firelight play over her peaceful face. Then he turned and retreated to his cot in the back room, leaving her to the warmth and the quiet. The next morning, she woke with a start, still in the chair, Cass's coat a heavy, warm weight over her. The fire was a bed of glowing embers, and the first pale light of dawn was filtering through the window. Cass was already gone, out to the barn. The coffee was on the stove. Shame and a strange, unidentifiable warmth warred within her. Later that day, as she was kneading bread, he spoke from the doorway. "That was a bad storm." "It was," she agreed. He hesitated, then said, "Where did you learn to do what you do? With the sick folks?" The question was so unexpected it made her hands still in the dough. No one had ever asked her that. They asked for her help, but they never asked about her. "My mother," she said, her voice a little rough. "She was a midwife. She taught me about herbs, The rest, I learned from watching and from need. He nodded, absorbing this small piece of her past. She must have been a good woman, he said simply. He turned to go, then stopped. The coat suits you, he said, without looking back. And for the first time in a long time, Hetty felt a blush rise to her cheeks that had nothing to do with shame. As the first snows dusted the high ridges, a fragile warmth had settled in the Holloway household. In town, Hetty was no longer a scandal, but a quiet fixture. Her usefulness had earned her a measure of acceptance, but acceptance is a shallow-rooted plant, easily withered by the frost of gossip. Martha Abernathy had not forgotten her husband's public humiliation. She saw Hetty's growing esteem in the town as a personal affront. She watched and waited, and when she found her opening, she took it. The opening came in the form of a traveling peddler who had passed through the town where Hetty had lived before redemption. At a church sewing circle over tea and biscuits, Martha leaned in, her voice pitched for maximum effect, confidential yet carrying. "A terrible tragedy," she began, shaking her head. "The peddler was telling my husband about a family Hetty knew in Willow Creek. A little girl, taken with a lung fever." The women stopped their sewing, their needles poised. "Hetty tried to save her, of course," Martha continued, her tone dripping with false sympathy. "Sat with her for days, with all her herbs and potions, but the child passed. They said Hetty was overconfident, that she should have sent for a real doctor sooner." The implication was clear and poisonous. Hetty wasn't a healer. She was a danger. Her quiet competence was recast as reckless pride. "It's a shame," Martha concluded, sighing. "She means well, I'm sure. But some people just seem to bring misfortune with them." The poison spread quickly. The next time Hetty went to town, the nods were hesitant. Eyes slid away from hers. Mrs. Gable, who had been so grateful, crossed the street to avoid her. The warmth that had been building around her pulled back like water before a hard frost. She was once again an outsider, this time marked not as useless, but as unlucky, a far more sinister brand. Hetty felt the chill as keenly as the winter wind. She did not defend herself. She did not go to Martha and demand a retraction. A lifetime of being misjudged had taught her the futility of words against a current of ill will. Her silence was a deep and painful habit, a retreat to the only fortress she had ever known. She simply withdrew, her world shrinking back to the confines of the ranch. Cass noticed the change immediately. She was quieter, her movements more contained. The light in her eyes had dimmed. He heard the talk on his next trip to town for grain. He stood at the counter of the hardware store, listening as two men discussed it in low tones. His face remained impassive, but a muscle tightened in his jaw. He paid for his grain, loaded his wagon, and headed home. He found Hetty in the barn, gathering eggs, her shoulders slumped. He said nothing about the rumors. He knew that to bring the ugliness into their home would be to give it a power it didn't deserve. Instead, he walked over to the stall where she was working. "The fence on the north pasture needs checking before the next big snow," he said, his voice even. "It's a two-person job. I'll need your help tomorrow." It was a simple statement, but it was an anchor. It said, "I trust you, I need you. You belong here with me, doing this work." It said, "Their words don't matter." Hetty looked up at him, and in his steady gaze, she saw not a man who believed the gossip, but a man who was building a wall against it. She gave a small, grateful nod. "I'll be ready," she said. The cold snap held the land in its grip. The rumors, however, did not freeze. They festered, kept warm in the closed rooms and small gatherings of the town. Hetty's trips to redemption became brief, functional affairs. She would get what was needed and retreat to the sanctuary of the ranch. The Abernathy store was a place she avoided entirely, sending Cass for the few things she couldn't get elsewhere. But one afternoon, the flour bin was empty, and Cass was miles away, checking traps along the creek. A storm was predicted for the next day. She had no choice. Steeling herself, she hitched the small buckboard and drove to town. The bell above the door of Abernathy's general store sounded unnaturally loud in the tense quiet that fell as she entered. Mr. Abernathy was behind the counter, a smug, knowing look on his face. Martha was there too, arranging a display of winter bonnets. "Well, look what the wind blew in," Abernathy said, his voice slick with false bonhomie. "Running low on supplies at the charity house?" Hetty ignored him, her gaze fixed on the flour sacks at the back of the store. "I need 20 pounds of flour, Mr. Abernathy." "Flour," he mused, tapping a finger on the counter. "Of course. A big woman needs her bread." He leaned forward. "Still enjoying your good fortune? Surprised he hasn't realized his mistake by now. Some things you can't return, I suppose." The cruelty was deliberate, meant to land where it would hurt most. It was a direct echo of his first public insult, a reminder of her place. The few customers in the store looked down at their shoes, embarrassed but unwilling to interfere. Hetty felt the old, familiar armor of stillness settle over her. She would not let him see her break. But before she could form a reply, the bell on the door rang again. Cass stood there, his face like thunder. He must have finished early and seen the buckboard. He walked directly to the counter, his steps silent and heavy. He did not look at Abernathy. He stood beside Hetty, his presence a solid, unmovable wall. He put a hand on the small of her back, a simple, possessive gesture that the entire store could see. Then he turned his cold, quiet gaze on the shopkeeper. "My wife isn't a piece of goods, Abernathy," he said, his voice dangerously low. "And you will speak to her with respect, or you and I will have a conversation you won't enjoy." Abernathy paled, shrinking back from the counter. Cass's reputation for quietness was matched only by the unspoken understanding that he was not a man to be crossed. He tossed a coin on the counter. "The flour," he said. He loaded the sack himself, then turned from the cowed shopkeeper to his wife. Right there, in the middle of the store, before the silent witnesses, he looked at her. His eyes were no longer angry, but filled with a raw, honest emotion that made her heart ache. "Hetty," he said, his voice for her alone, yet his stance for everyone. "When I asked you to marry me in this room, I was angry. I did it to shut him up." He took a breath. "I'm asking you now to stay married to me because this house ain't a home without you in it. Because I wake up in the morning thinking about the coffee you made, and I fall asleep thinking about whether you're warm enough." He reached out and touched her cheek, his calloused thumb gentle against her skin. "Stay with me, Hetty. Not as an arrangement, as my wife. For good." Tears she had refused to shed for Abernathy's cruelty now welled in her eyes for Cass's kindness. She looked at this quiet, steady man who had seen her, truly seen her, from the very beginning. She raised her own hand and covered his. "There's nowhere else I'd rather be," she whispered. 2 weeks later, on a Sunday morning crisp with the promise of more snow, they stood on the steps of the small clapboard church. It wasn't a grand wedding, but a quiet renewing of their vows, with the town minister presiding. Hetty wore a simple dress of dark blue wool, one she had made herself. Cass stood beside her in his best coat, his hat held respectfully in his hands. More people came than Hetty had expected. Mrs. Gable was there, her son Sam standing shyly beside her. The foreman from the Miller Ranch came, his arm now out of its splint. The widow Jensen and her 3 boys sat in the front pew. They were not just spectators. They were witnesses, their presence a quiet, communal endorsement. The Abernathys were notably absent. The ceremony was brief, the words familiar but imbued with a new, profound meaning. When the minister pronounced them husband and wife, for the second and final time, Cass didn't offer a defiant statement. He simply took Hetty's hand, his grip warm and sure, and smiled at her. It was a small, private smile, but it felt more binding than any public decree. The gossip fell silent. It was as close to an apology as the town of Redemption was capable of giving. A week after the service, a small, unmarked parcel appeared on their porch. Inside was a bag of fine white sugar, a luxury they rarely bought. There was no note, but Hetty knew it was from Martha Abernathy. It was an offering, a concession, a silent admission of defeat. Hetty used it to bake a cake. Seasons turned, winter's grip loosened, giving way to the muddy thaw of spring, then the green abundance of summer. The Holloway Ranch thrived. The house, once spare and silent, was now filled with the quiet hum of a shared life. The scent of baking bread often mingled with the smell of leather and wood smoke. Hetty's heavy leather satchel, the one she had always kept packed and ready by the door as if expecting to be sent away at any moment, now had a permanent home. It sat on a small table in the main room, its flaps open, its contents, dried herbs, clean bandages, spools of thread, no longer the tools of a transient healer, but part of the fabric of the household. It was not a symbol of her usefulness anymore. It was a part of her, and she was home. One evening, as the autumn colors returned to the hills, Cass came in from the cold, stamping his boots on the porch he had long since repaired. Hetty was by the fire, mending one of his shirts, the familiar weight of it in her lap. She looked up as he entered and handed him the mug of coffee she had waiting on the hearth. He took it, his cold fingers brushing against hers. He didn't drink. Instead, he set the mug down and put his large, warm hand over hers, stilling her needle. The shirt rested between them. He said nothing, but his touch spoke of everything, of gratitude, of belonging, of a love that had been built not with grand words, but with 1,000 small, steady acts of care. She had arrived in Redemption as a woman branded useless, but here, in the quiet warmth of this house, held by this man's steady hand, she was not just useful, or even priceless. She was, finally and completely, home.